Hi, and welcome to today's webinar covering Washington policy and COVID-19, and update on federal policy in that space as well. This is Caitlin Sickles. I'm a principal in the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. Joining me on today's webinar, my colleague Paul Nathanson, also from the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik from the Franklin Partnership. Most of the folks on the webinar will know us, but Paul and I do the public relations for NTMA and PMA. That means we are working on the social media and traditional media, trying to get the word out about the impacts of Washington policy on small and medium-sized manufacturers. Omar and John are working on the ground in Washington, D.C., working with members of Congress for policies that advance the perspectives of small and medium-sized manufacturers as well. Today's webinar, like all of the past 25, today is the 26th, is brought to you by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. These webinars used to cover just COVID and federal policy around COVID, but we've expanded and are covering other issues as well. Soon you'll see the agenda and know what's going on today. But there's more than just these webinars. So you can hear from us in other ways as well. You can stay connected with us between these bi-weekly webinars by listening to our podcast. That's the Talking with One Voice podcast. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. If you are an iPhone user, you can get it right on the podcast app. There's lots of other ways, of course, lots of other podcast distributors. You can also find us in our weekly 2 Minutes with One Voice video series, where one of the panelists on today's call, tackles a policy issue in 2 minutes or sometimes 3 or 4. But you can find that on the YouTube channel of either NTMA or PMA. So that's all the housekeeping notes. I'll now go to, here's a slide where you can see the agenda for what will be covered today, updates from CDC, from OSHA, from the IRS, and then there's, as you can see at the bottom, other information outside of just COVID. We'll be talking about, of course, what everyone in Washington is talking about, which is infrastructure. This time, is it real? With that, I'm going to turn it to John to start at the top and talk about the latest from CDC.
Well, thanks, Caitlin. There's been some recent action at the CDC regarding, they gave some recommendations with regard to ventilation and vaccines that we're going to go over. Let's start with ventilation. They made some recommendations. They did 3 additional frequently asked FAQs on the ventilation issue. For example, is it useful to use carbon dioxide monitors to determine your ventilation decisions? What about temperature and humidity in the workplace? Is this an effective way to prevent the spread of COVID? And then basically the use of fans. Is use of fans a effective use of for ventilation purposes? The CDC also expanded. There's a lot more products on the marketplace right now. And so they also provided some additional guidance on how you can make the best decisions to protect your workers in the workforce moving forward. In addition, there was additional questions that they did, and it's on the website at the bottom of the page. Can COVID spread through your HVAC system? So they addressed that issue. How long does it take to decontaminate a room where there may be some potential protection? How do you if the room perhaps is infected? So those are just some of the examples that the CDC looks at, and they give particular answers. Does ventilation filters capture the SARS and the COVID virus moving forward? So these are all some important questions. Directional airflow. What is it and how does it work? And is this something that we should be looking at? What is a HEPA filter, which is the higher end environmental air filters moving forward that are on the market today? And then does ultraviolet radiation, does that work? And what are the devices that are on the market? Does it help kill SARS and COVID? And so all that information is on that website at the bottom of the page. And then they go furthermore into similar issues that we just talked about. So this is a very important website, more on the carbon dioxide, more on the temperature and humidity, more additional information on the fans moving forward. Then they did additional guidance on how to deal with vaccines. And much of it is common sense. If you've read the newspaper or watched the news of how the vaccines are working, the Moderna, the Pfizer, J&J is temporary, been suspended, but what are the impacts that is going to have on people? But some of the recommendations moving forward is to encourage your employees, once they're eligible, keep in mind the word was encourage, not mandate, encourage your employees once they're eligible to go get the COVID vaccine. And they do suggest that they schedule that vaccine 1 or 2 days before a day off, so that it may be on a Thursday, Friday leading into a weekend. And then they encourage, make sure your employees are not all scheduling at the same time, so you're not shutting down, for example, your shipping department because everybody happens to be eligible at that time, and sort of stagger your employees that they're moving forward. And then they do say, anticipate absences specifically after those who have had the second Moderna or Pfizer shot. And I can attest to that because I just had my second shot yesterday, and I can assure you I'm not firing up all full cylinders today moving forward. So those are just some recommendations. Omar, there's been, we have a new Secretary of Labor, and he made some recent decisions about emergency temporary standards.
That's right, John. They did really just jump right into it, and piggybacking on some of those ultraviolet lights, actually, they also on April 9th did create a website just specifically for those ultralights. Some of them, I have one upstairs in our HVAC here at home, not for COVID, but apparently they do work on that. So those that are looking at different options, especially as you're having to close the doors in some facilities, you get into the heat or open them, vice versa, take a look at those resources. But staying with workforce here, on OSHA, we still do not have an emergency temporary standard. Now that we have a new secretary, he did just the other day have a statement released from the Department of Labor saying that they do not want to issue an emergency temporary standard right now. He is further reviewing it and reviewing with CDC. Now, what this is back in January, President Biden issued an executive order directing OSHA to release, if it found necessary, an emergency temporary standard for all workplaces for COVID-related reasons by March 15th. That date came and went, and we did not receive anything from them. We did see a national emphasis program that we'll talk about on the next slide, but that has guidance and that is not binding. An emergency temporary standard would have that force of rulemaking and effectively create a new set of standards that would be required to be met by employers. From what we're hearing, the regulatory text itself, so meaning some of the actions that are recommendations rather, are not so much in doubt, but it's rather what is the CDC science on it. Some of that goes to 3 feet, 6 feet, especially as we're seeing variance and evolution. And you just saw the new CDC standards John just went through with regards to ventilation. And now that ventilation was being worked on by CDC, OSHA wants to try to incorporate such of that as well. And so we do believe that there's still likely going to be an ETS, emergency temporary standard, based on what we're hearing, but it might not likely be until May. So as you can see, based on the bottom, he did the Secretary order a rapid update based on the CDC analysis and the latest information that we just reviewed for you all. This keeps us back under what we call the National Emphasis Program that was issued in March for the COVID vaccine, for the COVID pandemic. The link down below takes you to all of the NEPs. When you click on 2021, it'll give you the one from the one that they just released right now. The National Emphasis Program, what this effectively does is it directs OSHA inspectors, investigators, and others to focus on certain high-risk areas. We already have, these are just a sample, we've got about a dozen NEPs already in place: combustible dust, hazardous machinery, this affects all of you, silica, obviously, and now you see coronavirus has been added on an NEP. So again, this really just directs them to take a closer look at some of these areas that they consider high risk and high target, and where manufacturing our specific NAICS codes of 333, 332, we fall under the target 2 list. So we are on the list, but we're not on target 1, which, as you can imagine, are going to be more of nursing homes and hospital environments. But you are on the target list. So at some point, do expect additional emphasis, as it's called a National Emphasis Program, especially until we get an ETS in place. Quickly, here's what you can take a look and expect on the timeline, especially until we get an emergency temporary standard. The National Emphasis Program, since so many of you are in states, the 3 dozen or so states, I think it is, that about 33, 34 states that have their own programs, the they do have a timeline for the state OSHAs, so for Cal OSHA, MyOSHA, and others, to move forward and develop their own plan. So as you can see here, state plans inform OSHA of their intent. That's coming up there. And then you have the state plans adopt the NEP and then show that they've done it. So that's kind of what you're going to take a look at here moving forward as this gets closer to you and the inspections there. But John, we have seen some other changes and significant ones, in fact, that are going to affect the employers. The next few slides are going to be a little heavy on the HR side, and you've definitely got CPAs that can handle this for you. But we just wanted to flag a couple of things here, starting with COBRA, that you all might want to take back for consideration.
Absolutely. As part of the American Relief Plan, the $1.9 trillion package, they did include language in there to creating the COBRA premium program. So essentially 100% of eligible employees are eligible for COBRA through September of this year. What does that mean? Well, an employee needs to indicate by April 1 that they are utilizing the COBRA program, but the employer is the one who's going to be paying the COBRA, the health insurance premiums, and then they will receive a refundable tax credit based on against their quarterly taxes. If the credit exceeds their quarterly payments, they can still apply for a refund when they file their Form 941, which is their quarterly tax return. So know that COBRA is in existence 100% until September of this year. They also issued frequently asked questions on that COBRA issue. Well, who is eligible? And essentially, any group health insurance plan that is sponsored by an employer or a union, those are the people who would be eligible, and if they fall under ERISA. So those are the people who would qualify for that moving forward. In addition to federal and state employees would be eligible for that COBRA moving forward. So I just want to make sure all is aware of that. But Omar, there's been also, the IRS has made some determinations, clarifications on the employer retention tax credits, the ERTC.
That's right. This is something on which we fought quite hard to make some changes to, as initially those of you that were having a PPP loan forgiven were not eligible for it. That was one of the changes we made, in addition to changing how some of the gross receipts test and making it back at 20%. I know the number highlighted here is 80, but once you look at it, we look at it the other way. Have you lost 20% or more, and we were able to bring that down from a 50% margin. Just this, what it allows you now that we're getting into the second quarter of 2021. This is for all of you that are going to try to claim the ERTC. Please keep in mind how that might interact with the PPP loan that you have, so you do not get into a double dip situation. But this does clarify that you will be still comparing to the quarters in 2019. So when you're figuring out your revenue test, whether or not you meet it, you will take Q1 or Q2 in 2021 and compare those to 2019. So that remains consistent with before. Something else that we just did want to put in there that your CPAs would take note of, but this something might have just gotten missed along the way, just with all that was happening. There was a change in law last year, and we just want to clarify on meal expensing. Again, we are not CPAs. That's why we're copying and pasting here, but to clarify that there is a temporary period for 100% meal expensing, and that will run through December 31st of 2022. So we've got a 2-year window for the 100% deduction, and that obviously can help folks that are getting back out there. Something to keep in mind that some of you, if you've got a truck that comes to the shop and or one of those areas, then no, that's not going to qualify. A restaurant in the building, you know, use your judgment. But anyway, we just wanted to throw that one out there as well. There was one question that came in about COBRA. Does the employer need to notify a separated employee about the reimbursement rule?
Did we lose Omar?
Hey, John, I think we lost Omar.
Okay. Paul, can you read that question? Can you read that question that Omar is talking about? I can't see it on my screen.
Talk about the employee retention credit update.
No, the COBRA one.
It's my audio. All right, now I'm back, I think.
There you're back.
All right.
Okay. Okay.
That was odd. Sorry about that all, but was trying to answer that one question. right here with regards to the Department of Labor FAQ on COBRA. Apologies for somehow, I don't know why that would have happened. Again, the question, does the employer need to notify a separated employee about COBRA reimbursement rate? Our recollection is that's answer Q 4 or 5 or 6. It's in there. We believe the answer is yes. If you'll click on that FAQ, that will lead you there, but we will verify that as well. So again, sorry about that. John, do you just want to finish off? The PPEs are deductible for individuals here.
Yeah, I do think the 100% meal expensing is sort of a nod to the restaurant industry to give them a boost during these very difficult times. So, and then they came out with that, you know, the PPEs that you purchase or individuals purchase is a deductible expense. It's considered a healthcare expense, so it falls under that 7.5% threshold that you must meet. But they also did clarify that you can use your HSA to, for example, reimburse for PPP purchases moving forward. Of course, if you do reimburse through the HSA, that purchase is no longer considered a deductible expense. Let's move to the PPP program. Just a reminder that the PPP program was extended, is set to expire on May 31st. So we know most of our NTMA and PMA members have taken advantage of either the first or second draw of the PPP program. For those who haven't, we just want to remind you that May 31st is the deadline. After a slow start with initiating that second draw, this next chart shows at how well received both the first and second draw is. When you look at the total number of loans that have been issued, they've been very similar between first draw and second draw. What we do see is the average loan amount has been significantly higher in the second draw. And so while many of us, you know, will behind the scenes grumble about federal government and the federal government does nothing right, this I think is a true testament of a federal government program that has worked very well. One point I just want to point out, in the past when you looked at the rankings of the PPP program by industry, we were always ranked in the fourth. You know, at the fourth level, we've dropped to the fifth level, but I think that's because so many in the manufacturing world have taken advantage of the PPP program.
Before we leave that, so John, I want to pause here for a quick second on forgiveness, since we did have one of our One Voice members reach out to us this morning to ask a question about those with loans over $2 million or more. First, a warning, this thing's running out of money. So if you have not applied for your first round or your second draw, now's the time to do it, in addition to it closing. So I don't even know that it'll make it to May 31st. But with regards to loans over $2 million, since there's not been a lot of movement because you have Form 3509, that additional necessity questionnaire that you had to fill out. We did email Senate Small Business Committee Democrats this morning. They did write back to us and said that they are hearing that increasingly situation of delays in forgiveness for loans over $2 million that are now stretching beyond that 90-day mark. They have reached out to the SBA this morning as well, as we've spoken to them, and we'll touch base with them next week to see if they're getting any other movement, as they are hearing of similar complaints that are out there. The lenders are complaining because they want to get their fees paid for the individuals that are responsible for the loans. And then also many of you are eager to get these off your books, especially as principal payments obviously are beginning to be due. So we are aware of the issue. We're working on the issue. We've reached out to the Democrats on the Senate side, and also the House Republican committee staff over there on the other chamber, and we'll keep you posted on anything further. But John, speaking of Capitol Hill, we are getting ready to maybe move something again.
Yeah, so the Congress, I mean, it's been almost 100 days since the Biden administration came in. They had a very aggressive and successful legislative agenda to date, passing the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. And now, you know, it's really infrastructure week, month, maybe infrastructure year. The president has released a blueprint for a $2.25 trillion infrastructure plan moving forward. This is probably the first of a two-step process that we're going to see. We expect the second part of the Biden plan to be released probably by the end of April. We'll touch on that a little later. But here, Omar, I mean, there's a lot of controversy. I mean, this is directly from the Biden administration briefing papers of where that money is going for the particular programs. We're going to go into it in a lot more detail in the next several slides. But the goal is roads, bridges, broadband, and providing additional technological tools to enhance whether it's workforce, whether it's caregiving, a whole number of other programs out there, as you can see on this chart moving forward.
Yeah, and let's keep in mind, you're going to see the word proposes on each of these slides, because that's exactly what it is. The president put out his skinny budget, we call the PBR, just the other day. No, it's not an adult beverage. That's the president's budget, what he asked for, request. And these are just requests. Congress is going to have to actually do something here. It's not just going to rubber stamp what a president put out. And often you're going to hear us say the president proposes and Congress disposes. And so when we start going through some of these other slides and the pay-fors, we do have to keep in mind that Congress is not quite there yet. And even the president himself has started to back off some of the requirements and requests that he's got in his own plan. But let's just start with, when we get the question, okay, we hear about $300 billion for manufacturing. What does that mean? Well, they're including a lot of things into that category, whether it's some of the lending proposals and access to credit you'll see on the next slide, or on the research and development here that you're seeing quite a bit here. The Endless Frontier Act that Chuck Schumer is moving forward, that is a China-related bill with regards to supply chains. Those that are interested, reach out to us. We'll let you know what's going on that front with Senator Todd Young and Schumer's effort, and Coons and Rubio, and now Menendez, the Foreign Relations Committee. But they're really putting a lot of money into research, a lot of it with public-private partnerships, and they are also making sure that manufacturing is a major component when you get into the actual details of some of these incubators that they want to create in some parts of the country, especially as they look to funding. Now, some of this is going to be more seed funding for the smaller businesses and startups, but there is additional emphasis on the SBA loans and some of those longer term, lower interest loans that we've been talking about in the past. And that's been a big priority of ours, to make sure that some of the SBA programs that have been successful that our members use continue to stay viable. And then lastly here, before I turn it over to John, we can kind of get into some of the taxes and what that might look like. There is funding in here for workforce development. We do believe that in the end, there will be some kind of a workforce training and recruitment and outreach on job training, youth oriented, and also for those that have been long-term separated, meaning those, I think it's 27 weeks or more. Yeah, 27 weeks or more. And that's going to be the concern like we had when we were dealing with this last time in the 99 weekers. So we do expect some job training funding to be in there. We are talking to folks about it, but they still have to look to a pathway forward and how to pay for all this, John.
And to Omar's point that the president proposes and the Congress disposes, this is where the rubber meets the road. We have been talking about infrastructure for probably 5-6 years now, and they've never been able to get over the hump of, okay, we all recognize our roads and bridges are crumbling, but how are we going to pay for it without increasing the deficit? And I think we are entering a sort of a perfect apex of where the need and those who are willing to look at the pay fors in a very serious way. Now, both Republicans and Democrats are not unified on either side. So when we talk about how the President Biden is proposing to increase the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, there's no monolithic universal support within the Democratic conference on that proposal. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, for example, feels very strongly that that tax rate should not be more than 25%. Congressmen, the folks from New York and New Jersey, feel very passionately that the state and local tax, the SALT provision, must be adjusted, and that they are not going to, they don't want to support a legislative fix or a transportation bill without some of those issues being addressed. And so know that we're a long ways from a final bill. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, is hoping that we can get something by July 4th moving forward, so that the House would pass it and pass it over to the Senate. But here, these are just some of the ideas. Furthermore, there's also, in addition to calling for the corporate tax increase, as we had mentioned, there's going to be a second bill moving forward. There probably is going to be some individual tax adjustments in that. But the other focus is they're going to be looking carefully at those who have offshored and limiting those people, limiting the expenses, the deductibility of certain expenses if you offshore jobs, and then perhaps look at the tax code to provide incentives for those who bring jobs back into this country moving forward.
Yeah, and so let's take a look at where we are. And again, before everyone starts pulling their hair out, I think that most of us would agree that Speaker Pelosi's July 4th target is quite ambitious. The real deadlines that we'll talk about here on the next slide, on the next steps and where they go. But where are we going, and what is One Voice doing here? we've been having some meetings on Capitol Hill with regards to some of the tax provisions and doing outreach with our coalition partners. And as John mentioned, I don't know that they'll get to the 28%, at least maybe not universally. We're certainly starting to hear from some moderate Democrats, some blue dogs. Do they create a two-tiered system for the C corporations? And to put in perspective, about 28 to 27% of our members are C corporations. So almost 2/3 of them, yeah, about 60 some odd percent are pass-through entities paying at the individual tax rate. So for our C corps, and keep in mind, most of your customers, especially larger ones, will be C corps as well. They're trying to think of, do they create one for small businesses at 25%, then another one at 28%? We do know that there is momentum building in DC for a minimum corporate tax rate. Now, that will probably be for businesses that, let's just throw a number of $1 billion or more in revenue. Do they go down to the 500 or the 250, which then starts getting closer to impacting some of our members? But again, keep in mind, it impacts your customers. They have fewer resources to spend on you. So that's why we're also monitoring that. We do think that they could end up somewhere in that 24 to 26 rate, or maybe a scaled. And on the individual side, we haven't seen the president's proposal yet. We're hearing during his speech on April 28th to the joint session of Congress. It's technically not State of the Union since it's his first. We're probably going to get more information in and around that date. But what we do know now is that we have been meeting and working to prevent any limitations or elimination of the Section 199A. That's the deduction, that 20% that reduces the effective tax rate for all of our pass-throughs. Again, about 2/3 of our member companies there. So that's where we're putting most of our priority in trying to deal with that issue. And then also, we do expect to see some other changes when it comes to business deductions potentially. And we've made estate tax obviously a big priority, and especially being able to maintain some of the stepped up basis that we know President Biden wants to come after as well, since that is going to be a big target list for folks. But John, I think this is just a sample target list of where they're going with it. I think that you definitely need to look out for pay-fors, and you've heard me say this at least before. Whether this was going to be Trump with McConnell leading it and a Republican speaker, you still would have had some kind of a tax increase this year. So the question is now who pays and how much, and these are some of the areas on which we're lobbying.
Yeah, and in the end, Omar, in the end, wherever they fall on the corporate rate, and I agree with you, it's likely not going to be 28%. It will be a 25%. It may end up being a two-tiered program that you talked about, and the small business program. And we're going to be fighting to make sure we maintain that 199A that Omar talked about. But in the end, don't you think that there's going to be, whatever they decide on the small business corporate rates, they will have some parity with a small business Section 199? I think
for some of them, I think they will. What they're also looking at probably doing is defining what they call the wealthy and the wealth tax and the higher earners. And that's where you also get additional vulnerability. So in some ways, I think that the people that they're really trying to target and quote, I don't use the wrong word, but punish really and going after, because that's what these tax increases will do, is going to be those that have heavy multinational footprints for overseas. And that's why they're creating that multinational, at least the larger C corporation minimum corporate rate, whether it's 15% or some other. And then also those individuals that aren't creating jobs, meaning they're trading contracts on Wall Street. So hopefully that's why we're being so cautious. But we also don't want to have the retirees of manufacturing plants down in Naples get hit with some new tax bills because of their passive income hits a certain limit from combined income. So those are some of the areas. But I think you're right, John, that right now members of Congress are falling hand over foot right now to be more pro-manufacturing. You really do have their attention right now. And that's been some of our meetings. You want us to lead the economy out of this and be the supply chain, then you're going to tax us at the same time. Doesn't make sense.
Yep. And so where do we go from here? So as Omar said, the president speaks before a joint session of Congress on April 28th. That will get a little more idea of where he's going. The president and his administration has indicated all along that they're looking at like a two-part approach to infrastructure. There's going to be this jobs and transportation package that we've been talking about, but then there's also going to be a family resources type bill moving forward that we expect some details to come out, if not at the joint session of Congress, either shortly before or shortly after. As we mentioned, we expect Speaker Pelosi is hoping to get this bill passed before July 4th recess, which would give the Senate time to take it up. Shortly in July. They're out for most of August for the congressional recess, and come back in September and hopefully pass it then. September is a critical date because the debt ceiling, which is the government's credit card, they need to raise the debt ceiling in September. The debt ceiling expires, and so it needs to be raised. And we do believe the Congress is seeing this transportation package moving forward as one of the few vehicles leaving the station that has a potential to get presidential signature, that would be attached to whatever the Congress passes. Now, this is not just the Democrat plan. Senate Republicans are working on doing their own infrastructure transportation program. While the president's plan is $2.5 trillion, I think the Senate Republican plan is looking at, last I saw, they're looking at between $600 and $800 billion on that. We don't believe, so as much as we hear from the White House and Republicans and Democrats that they want to work in a bipartisan way, we don't believe Senator Schumer anticipates a bipartisan solution, at least coming out of the Senate. He's looking at putting together a transportation package using the procedure called budget reconciliation, where they only need the 50 rather than the 60 votes to pass legislation. So we do expect that this is going to will be the vehicle that they use to pass this. And when the president does release his family bill, there's going to be some good things in there. There's going to be some proposals that many on this webinar may have anxiety over. Please know that not everything that's in this family bill is necessarily, especially if they use budget reconciliation, there has to be a revenue impact on it to be eligible for inclusion. If you recall, during the American Rescue Act, the minimum wage got knocked out of the bill because it lacked a revenue impact. So not all of the proposals out there are going to be necessarily be eligible for inclusion. But as Nancy Pelosi would say, she wants one bill to be passed, which would have the infrastructure, broadband, roads, bridges, and such, and then another bill, which would be either the Democrats' wish list moving forward or a messaging bill moving forward. So it's still a little early to know all the details, especially since we don't know much of the details of what President Biden is looking at, including in the second package moving forward. But in the end, I think he is hopeful that in the end, both of them will come together and be signed into law. But we're less optimistic.
Yeah, I think they're going to be talking about some bipartisanship. They did have some Republicans over to the White House the other day, but in the end, they don't have to be. And Republicans have zero political incentive to help Democrats when Pelosi literally only has a 2-seat voting majority, at least right now, until vacancies get filled. And McConnell is on the verge of potentially taking the Senate back. So, when people are going to do some feel-good discussions and you'll read some stories about bipartisanship, where they're going to just ram this thing through at some point. And so that's why we're working with those Democrats that we can to make sure that, at least on the tax side, that they understand the needs of manufacturers in the supply chain to prevent any further disruption that we're already seeing. Because, Paul, disruption is all we're hearing right now when it comes to the metals: red metals, stainless, regular, cold, hot, aluminum, delays. I mean, what do they say? What's the point of getting a price quote if you can't get the material?
Yeah, we continue to hear from members about the chaos in the metals markets. Just to give you an idea, here's the chart that we update every couple of weeks, and we use hot rolled prices. The blue line are US prices, and the other lines are EU and China and world export prices, as well as scrap prices. So we understand it continues to be an issue. There is only a number of things that the administration can do. We also know that stainless, on the stainless market's having another issue with the ATI strike going on now. And while ATI is already had announced they were getting out of the market, obviously the other suppliers are not prepared to make up for the supply loss there. So we are pressing the administration because the one thing that they can do is end these Section 232 tariffs. As you probably know, the steelworkers and their allies are really doing an all-out effort to convince the administration to keep them. They came out with a steelworker funded study that shows that the tariffs added like a couple thousand jobs in the steel industry, which, when you think about it, all the money that it's the billions of dollars that steel users have paid and the retaliatory tariffs, the loss of revenue from exports being shut out because of retaliatory tariffs, that all this for a couple thousand jobs in the steel industry when we have 6.8 million jobs in your industry, steel using industry. So we are pressing that point. There is a pressure point coming up on the Biden administration, and that is June 1st. June 1st is the date where the European Union and the United Kingdom have announced that the retaliatory tariffs on US whiskey exports to the EU and the UK will increase. Right now, there's a retaliatory tariffs because of our steel tariffs of 25% on US whiskey exports. That will go up to 50% on June 1st, which the whiskey makers in the US have said that they cannot, they will be shut out of the market. There has been this, tariffs and retaliatory tariffs, you gain a lot of friends in your fight as the retaliatory tariffs kick in. And the whiskey makers and the alcohol industry have now weighed in with the Hill. They've generated a letter signed by 50 members of Congress, bipartisan, urging the administration to resolve this tariff issue. So, there are more and more allies there, and despite what you may read and what the steel industry says, the entire, basically the entire manufacturing sector, except for the steel industry and others now who are being hit by retaliatory tariffs, are advocating for the administration to do something, at least with the EU and UK and other allies, that there shouldn't have been tariffs in the first place. If this is a China issue, let's focus on China overcapacity. That's the issue. And as we've talked about many times, the Biden administration has said that they want to create a worldwide coalition of allies to confront China on their trade policies. And our allies have made it clear that they can't participate in such a coalition when the Section 232 steel tariffs are still in place. Next slide, please, Omar. So we can, our coalition of American metal manufacturers and users continues to make news. We get calls a couple times a week. Be on the lookout for a Washington Post story coming out early next week. We had, as I mentioned, I think previously, we had a Washington Post reporter visit one of our members up in Pennsylvania, and has also received information about what the situation is with the metals market, and there should be a story. So we continue to create some attention on this. We've also been reaching out. We got a outreach from the association that represents the domestic, the formerly big three auto companies, who are feeling the pinch as well regarding metal supply. So we will keep you posted. We're doing a full court press.
Just to add here that while we are doing a lot of press around steel and steel supply issues, we are also working with chapters and companies, and also, of course, at the national level around other important issues to the industry. One of those is skilled workforce. I want to draw your attention to a press release that went out from NTMA, and in particular from the Pittsburgh chapter of NTMA earlier this week, because the chapter and its Spots IQ program received an important grant that will help them expand their program for young people. This is the kind of news that we want to share, of course. So this press release was actually put together by Bots IQ, as you can see, which is a program of that chapter, but we were able to help them spread the news by putting it out also from NTMA into our press list in the area. And, this is obviously the kind of thing we want to share. So if there are folks who are on the call who have similar news and want help in promoting that, or just want to make us aware of it so that we can promote it in other ways or keep it in mind as Omar and John are doing Hill meetings, definitely feel free to share it. If you have news and you don't yet have a press release, that's okay too. Reach out to us and we can be helpful on that as well.
In addition, both NTMA and PMA maintain resources that you can find on their websites. Please contact either Bill Padnos or Christy Carmigiano, and you'll be able to get that information with regards to grants that are available in each state. Our firm, the Franklin Partnership, puts out every month a large Excel tracking matrix that shows the different grants that are available, and also the tax credits that may be available, whether you're hiring or expanding and doing some other infrastructure work. So we encourage you to use those resources that are made available, because you all have us around. But John, speaking of resources, anything that folks can do to be helpful always helps.
Yeah, if you've enjoyed this content over the past 26, 27, 28 weeks, whatever we've been doing these webinars, if you've enjoyed the 2 minutes with one voice or podcast, we hope you would, and we know many of you who are on this call have already contributed to both the PMA Advocacy Fund and NTMA's GAP Fund. But if for those of you who don't, who haven't yet, but do appreciate the content that we are providing on a regular basis, on nearly a daily basis, keeping you updated on the breaking news of what is happening, what decisions are being made at the various agencies and departments in Washington and within the Congress. So we hope you would dig deep and continue to support the GAP and the Advocacy Fund moving forward.
With that, there's a question box over on the right. We don't have any in queue now, so we'll hang on the line for a few extra minutes here if anybody wants to ask us any questions. We are going back to doing these monthly. So our next update will probably be, I think, around May 19th or whatever that Friday is, somewhere in that range, or May 14th, excuse me. So we'll let you know, depending on where things stand with regards to negotiations. The closer we get to Memorial Day, the more we will know about taxes, especially as the Ways and Means Committee is going to start ramping up here next week and the last 2 weeks in April, as they start to formulate what the next steps might be on pay-for-its for infrastructure bill. With that, not seeing any questions coming through, please keep in mind you can still always reach us. The Washington Wire went out a few days ago. That's the newsletter. We also did record a video, the 2 minutes with one voice, that also went out earlier this week as well, which you can again find on YouTube or find from your contact Bill or Christie. And in addition to the webinar, you'll find all of this materials at onevoiceinfo.org. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend. We'll talk to you later.